of you will now get a chance to understand what the accreditation process is looking for in student learning outcomes assessment. My purpose today is to give you a sense of what it is you're looking at in a self-study and while you're on site about what the program has done in terms of assessing its student learning outcomes. Okay? So let's start off with some definitions and what the assessment is. Again, this is central to our task as educators, I believe, is the assessment of student learning. Not the assessment of our teaching, but the assessment of students' learning. As educators, we care about learning. As teachers, we care about our process of being teachers. But as educators, we care about learning. And I think it changes for some of us the way we think. That student learning is the focus, and that all the stuff that is often within the instructor's control are simply the means to the end. The way you structure the course, the curriculum that you are a part of, your expertise as an instructor, quality of the students that come into your classroom. You know, I mean, sometimes you have such good students, you're just doing a little bit of honing on the edge on what they know, because they're already really good students. Others, you're really going from here and getting them up to here. Others, you're going from here and getting them up to here. But it really, this notion of focusing on learning really can flip the way some of us have thought historically into a little different direction. And this is a definition, I think this is pretty darn close to the definition in the PAB standards, that say that student learning outcomes clearly state the expected knowledge, skills, attitudes, competencies, and habits of the mind that students are expected to acquire at an institution of higher education. Now that is the statement from this thing called the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment. It proves you can form an organization about anything. Okay, and there is. NILOA, National Institute of Learning Outcomes Assessment. By the way, if you're interested in this, they have a free website, newsletter. You can get emails from them about new publications that come out. I get them. It's weird. I do. I like this stuff. And I think it's really interesting. They're talking about new ways to help faculty create better course-level student learning outcomes. They talk about impediments to programs doing good learning outcomes and assessments of them, all sorts of things. But the key here is they state the expectations for what students will learn in a variety of areas by the time they leave that institution. So no surprise, the standards, the accreditation standards, capture the knowledge, skills, attitudes, competencies, values that planners need to have by the time they go out into practice. The standards state the object of the sentence. They state the knowledge, what the knowledge is. They don't state what students are supposed to be able to do to it. Do they just repeat it? Do they memorize it? Do they apply it? Do they synthesize that knowledge across a variety of areas? So while student learning outcomes often can be a direct reflection of the accreditation standards in the curriculum section, they have to be massaged. They can't be just those because there's no verb associated with those things, so you have no way of measuring them. I can measure whether students have memorized things. I can measure whether they have applied things. But can I measure whether they know something? Not directly. I have to measure whether they've memorized it, whether they've applied it, whether they can demonstrate their knowledge through application. But to just simply measure a knowledge of the structure and form of human settlements, not going to happen. Okay. So, for practitioners, I often ask them to think about some of your best entry-level planners. What is the knowledge, skills, values, competencies, predispositions that those individuals have? And isn't that what you'd like to see? What they can tell you, what they know, what they can do, what they can demonstrate to you. For educators, I always tried to think of some of the best students that I had graduated out of my program in the last several years. That's where I want my students to be. Okay, what skills did they have? How did they incorporate the knowledge that they'd gotten in one course to a project in a different course? That's the cool part. Okay. What did they know? What could they do? And what values, both professional and personal, and dispositions did they exhibit? So just another graphic about the same knowledge, skills, values, ethics, and competencies or experience in doing. What influences your program level student learning outcomes? So at the program level, what influences that? Well, I'd say it's your program mission and vision. It's what graduates are expected to do and where you expect them to go once they finish your program. Current needs and future expectations of the profession. And then, oh, by the way, the PAB standards affect those. So the learning outcomes across all of the institutions of planning education in the country shouldn't look the same. They might have some similar factors because of this, but based on your own program's assessment of the future of planning, practice, and competency, where you want your graduates to go and what you expect them to do when they get there and what your mission is, should make them feel different. So how do programs plan to achieve those learning outcomes? Well, they develop courses with certain content and syllabi and assignments. They have faculty with expertise and qualifications. They have student quality and ability. They have student activities during the program. They have curriculum, content, and structure. All of those are the inputs designed to achieve those outcomes. And all of those are necessary ingredients and recipe to get to that gourmet meal of what you define as the learning outcomes for your students. Therefore, curriculum, courses, activities provide the opportunity to learn for students, but it's incumbent upon you to have to demonstrate that students actually learned. So your job as a site visitor is to look for 4 things in that student learning outcome assessment process. The program has to have a set of student learning outcomes at the program level, not for each course, but they need it for each course to get to the program level and vice versa. But at the program level, what are their student learning outcomes and what's the level of performance benchmark they want to achieve for each of those learning outcomes? Secondly, they have to have a curriculum map. And in the old days, we always had a curriculum map in our self-studies. It was called the curriculum matrix, and we had all of the criteria and all of the courses, and you put an X in everything of your courses. And for some reason, it was always important that you fill that thing with as many X's as you could, which suggests to me you have a lot of repetitive courses. Or you do a lot of development of all those things in all those courses. Or you have faculty who think they're doing everything in your curriculum in their course, and so they just filled them all. So fewer X's is better because it's actually saying, I am holding the instructor of that course accountable to achieving that learning outcome. All of a sudden, a lot of those X's will start disappearing then. Okay? From your folks who have wanted to be on that map. You also have to have identification of measures or evidence about student learning that will be collected and how. We'll talk about that. And then a schedule for collecting that evidence and using the results. So how do you collect it? How do you summarize it? How do you discuss it? And then how does that turn into improvements in the way students learn while they're in your program? Okay. You're seeing a lot of similarities in the structure of both the program improvement and student learning improvement. Same sorts of things going on. You have to state what you want to achieve. You've got to state how you're doing it, whether it's through a curriculum map or through the logic of your actions. You then have to measure what you have achieved and then say, what are you going to do with those results? And is it where you wanted it to be? So those are the 4 things that you're going to be looking for. So let's look at some learning outcomes. They are specific items that a program expects a student to develop, learn, or master during their degree completion process, and they include those classic 5 areas. This is yet another author in the world of student learning outcomes assessment. They establish at the program level what you want students to know at the end of the program and what you want them to be able to do at the end of the program. But student learning outcomes have to have 3 elements, and this is where the PAB standards aren't student learning outcomes. They are categories of learning outcomes. They have to specify an action by the students that's observable. They have to specify an action by the students that is measurable. And it has to specify an action that is done by the student. Okay. And that's the sort of thing that you're going to use in your lens as a site visitor to look at their learning outcomes at the program level and say, are those observable, measurable, or done by the student? Okay. The format of a student learning outcome is the following. There's lots of different ways you can do this, but they have to have 2 elements. They have to have an action verb and a something. Now, these somethings often are what's in the PAB standards. You know, they have to know about professional ethics. That's the something. But what do you want in your program students to do with professional ethics? Do you want them to demonstrate their knowledge of that professional ethics? And they could do so by assignments where they look at scenarios of ethics case studies and discuss them, write a paper, a short paper about it that the instructor reviews and says, wow, they did great. Or the ones who didn't, there's something that needs to be done to work on that. But to just say they need students, by the time students leave our program, they'll know professional ethics. Don't know what to do with that. The first sheet behind the stack of slides, the handout of the slides, the first sheet behind that is kind of a buff color, and that's the Bloom's action verbs. All the way back in 1954, this genius put together this taxonomy of action verbs. And they go, the cool thing about this is that it goes from lower order skills, thinking, to higher order thinking. So for someone to go from memorizing to discovering and designing something that synthesizes that material is a developmental process. And so in the program's student learning outcomes, they should be very clear that they're using the right action verb that they really mean. Is it about application of knowledge? Is it about, let me see for just a second. So they have knowledge, they have comprehension. So knowledge is can they regurgitate it back to you? Comprehension is do they actually understand it? Can they apply it? Can they analyze it? Can they synthesize it? And then can they evaluate it? These are classic, and honest to Pete, I have this taped to my desk because, first of all, I'm not good at synonyms, and I'll just use describe, 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 describe over and over again, which is fine, but I don't really mean that. But then it gives you some synonyms and really help you think about what is it you want students to be able to do by the time they leave your program. So I leave that with you just because it's a great resource, and everybody that does outcomes assessment has Bloom's taxonomy. There's some people who hate it, by the way, just so you know that. Some people hate it. I tend to like it, but that's just me, okay? Student learning outcomes are defined for courses in the curriculum, but they are also defined at the overall program level. And that's the focus of outcomes assessment for site visitors is clearly you have to have course level outcomes to fill in the matrix, but it's really about the program level ones that you're going to be reviewing at this stage. There's no set number of how many there should be. I don't know, typically 5 to 7. Each one often has 2 to 5 subparts. The fewer, the easier to measure. The more, the clearer what it is you want students to learn and demonstrate by the time they leave your program. So it's kind of somewhere in the middle. And let me show you some examples. These are actually examples of ones that I've been working on with programs in planning around the country. And it's ones that have been generated. I'm going to show you the high level outcome. For each of these, there were between 3 or 7 sub-outcomes that really are the things that you can measure. These aren't very measurable, and you'll see why in just a second, because they have multiple prongs to them. But develop and refine individual and professional practices that support a lifelong career in planning and advocacy. That's the prepare you to be a successful planner for the whole time of your career. And under this, it was know how to work in groups, know what to do with ethical dilemmas and how to address them. I mean, I'm not using the action verb thing, but just to give you the content area that's under this. But in this case, it's develop and refine those practices. So that's what these sub-outcomes would capture. Okay? Another one is apply lessons from planning history and theory to current conditions and challenges of diverse urban settings. Okay? I pulled this one out because it's talking about the mission of this program. The program for which this was written is about what really captures its mission by stating this. Okay? This is clearly a criterion of the standards, the curriculum standards. And so that's an easy crosswalk, but this is saying who they are as a program. So it's really saying this is, for our mission, how we're bringing this in. And then this third one, this is just, here you go. Construct, articulate, and defend. Okay, now if you look at Bloom's taxonomy, that is lots of different levels there and lots of high-level stuff. A community-based process of advocacy and change to achieve a more just, equitable, and sustainable community. Okay. Now, this is a program that's chosen to use this one to define its overall purpose in life And therefore, the rest of the learning outcomes are ways by which the program thinks they get students to that point. They have chosen to lead with that as their first learning outcome, which from a get students excited about your program, that's probably the best thing to do. But it's kind of backward when you read them, because then all of a sudden now you step back to saying, well, how do you describe the current conditions? How do you define what future you want? What is the pathway to change? And then how do you have those professional skills to be able to do this for the rest of the career? So, but you're seeing things that, yes, they're based on the standards, but they're authentic to the institution. Okay, sorry about that. Okay. Second element of the curriculum of the student learning outcomes assessment is the assessment, and the assessment plan is the curriculum map. And this links course level learning outcomes to the program learning outcomes. It also identifies where your learning outcomes are expected, so that if you're not achieving your program level learning outcome, you know what courses to look at and to start working through, which might suddenly produce lots of erased X's on your old curriculum matrix to now your new curriculum map. Okay. So I'll just give you a sense of the general format of these. You've got all your course titles and numbers across the top here in the columns. You have your student learning outcomes. You may have an upper level one with the measurable ones underneath here. Oops, geez Louise. Why do I do that all the time? The various sub ones under here, and then another major one, and sub ones under here, and then X's throughout here saying that it's covered in those courses. I've been working with a program that decided to do I, introduced in the course, D, developed in the course, and then A, assessed in the course as part of the program's assessment of student learning. Kind of cool. So here's an example of one. This is applying general planning, knowledge of law, economics, blah, 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 in the creation of blah, 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 just, prosperous, resilient communities. So here's the sub-outcome. So can they find, read, and comprehend academic and professional planning literature and engage in debate about the issues that they raise? It's covered in these 5 courses. And it will be, in this case, they did an A, it'll be assessed here and again here. And this is in the sequential nature of the curriculum. Therefore, you could do a preliminary assessment here, and if you're not really hitting where you want it to be, you can really focus more in these courses to where you can then make sure you're really hitting it out of the park by the time you get to the end. Okay? What's interesting is that this learning outcome can be assessed in one course, or 2 courses, or 3, 4, 5, but it only really needs to be assessed in one. It could be assessed in every course that it's being offered, but you really would like to make this as efficient as possible, so there's no need to assess it in all of them. You could, as a program, really focus on this end, and then if you're coming up short, then go back to this one. And then if you're having troubles there, then go back to the courses that are supposed to be doing the introductory work. So it's kind of a cool, makes logic of your curriculum. Third thing is you need to measure and provide evidence about what the students have learned. This is probably the part that makes everybody wring their hands. So we're going to do it quickly just to point to things that are important to be thinking about. They need to be measures of learning that are applied to student work. They can't be, well, we covered these chapters in this course from this book, and we all know that's the seminal book in this area, so therefore they know it. There are other criteria that require an alumni survey, which are self-reflections on what students learned and how they were prepared for their first jobs, those sorts of things. Self-reported information, we know its challenges and its strengths. I wouldn't put all my eggs in the self-reported basket. Okay. And it's students evaluating their own level of achievement, which I'm never comfortable with either. So it needs to be measures of learning that are applied to actual student work. But this is also important and required for program improvement. So don't just assume that an alumni survey is the way you get to student learning outcomes assessment. Just wanted to put that in here. So the direct measures, they are the most valid. The application of a rubric to a project or a paper. Okay. Rubrics, we all know about rubrics. Oh, we didn't hand those out. We'll hand them out on the break. I have an example of a rubric that is developed by, actually it's right up here, developed by AAC&U, Association of American Colleges and Universities. And rubrics are really cool because what they do is they have the learning outcome stated here. They have benchmarks of achievement across the top. And then they have text in each of those cells that describes what student work at that level of achievement for that learning outcome would look like. So you could imagine you would have one that's below acceptable, more than acceptable, outstanding, or below what's acceptable, close to acceptable, you can do as many categories as you want, columns in that rubric. And the idea is to make sure it's a good measure, meaning it's reproducible. You could give it to 5 different people and they'd come up with relatively good, consistent assessments of the same student's work. But it specifies what you want students to provide in the work that they do for that particular learning outcome. Rubrics, I think, are what's being used probably the most common, especially in graduate education. And then often applying them to end products, capstone projects, studio experiences, those sorts of things. You can also ask field supervisors about their ratings of the level of student knowledge or capability for different learning outcomes, because they are an objective observer of a student's work in a setting outside the classroom. So you could do a survey of field supervisors of internships. You could do a survey of employers of your graduates about how well they have those graduates as entry-level people demonstrated those different learning. Or you can take test items. You can take a particular question, an essay question, apply a rubric to it, and use that as a measure. It's an item of student work for which a rubric is applied to get a measure of the quality of that student's work. Similarly, you can use scores and pass rates on licensure exams, AICP, certification exams. You can use those, and you can get those scores broken out by different sections too. So you can find out if they're doing poorly on the law part, but overall they still passed. You know, you can get that sort of stuff. I point to these not to suggest you should use them, but to say, here are some of the issues associated with these measures. The literature says having a direct measure is really good, and then maybe easy to obtain corroborative information on indirect measures is also a good thing to do. So indirect measures, course grades, I can't tell you how many times I've fought, literally, argued with people about, well, if the student passes the course, then they learned what I wanted them to learn in that course. No. Well, why not? Well, what is included in the student's grade? Do you include attendance and/or participation in discussions? If you do, what does that have to do with learning? So maybe they were there all semester long and didn't learn a section of the course. So they offset their grade by good attendance and good participation and never achieved one of the learning outcomes of the course. So grades are summative measures. They are a single point in time measure that accumulates knowledge of student performance in a variety of areas, and therefore, by themselves, are not necessarily good direct measures of student learning. But they can be corroborative measures. Honors and awards and scholarships that students get, yeah, but there's uncertainty in the criteria that are used most of the time in those honors and awards. Unless you can establish that criteria, certainty probably doesn't work. Surveys, there's nothing wrong with asking an exit survey of students about what their opinions were, and you have to recognize this as their opinion, about whether they learned different program level learning outcomes and or how satisfied they were with that part of the curriculum. The student self-rating is the same, and alumni satisfaction, again, the word satisfaction is subjective, and so you get into all sorts of difficulties, not in what you're measuring, but how valid that measure is. Okay? Make sense? So those are the two sets of things that you can use. I think what I've seen in most programs that I've been working with, they're looking at rubrics, exam, AICP exam, and maybe a test question or two out of a key course that is like the one course that really hammers that learning, you know, example, law. You know, a lot of us have law courses, and in that law course we expect to have knowledge of the law, which is one of the criteria, not directly, but one of them. And then process issues come up in there too, in the law course. So there may be an exam question, a paper that's written in that course, and it's okay to have the faculty member assess and score with a rubric how students are doing in that course, and then report it back to the full faculty to help them understand how students are achieving that particular outcome. As long as that's what you've put on your curriculum map, and that's the course you've decided to assess for those outcomes. So the fourth thing is a schedule for collecting that evidence, using the results to improve student learning. So there needs to be a time, I would suggest annually, that the program gets together and looks at their student learning outcome assessment results, discusses them, figures out how they're doing, what's not working, what's working, and puts together a plan of action on how to move forward. And if not, then we're having some problems with the last part of all of this assessment process, which is then what do you do with the assessment? How do you turn those results into action that leads to improvement? So you'll see that then measuring student learning outcomes is valid measures and then benchmarks of level of performance, a schedule and a method. From whom is that, from whom do you collect information about their assessments of the student work? How often is that done? How many? Do you do everybody in the course? Do you ever do a random sample of 5? Those are all kind of design questions for which there's no direct answer. Then when the results are summarized, is there a discussion, and then what is the action that's required as a result of that? So the work of site visitors, first of all, do they have learning outcomes? And are they really learning outcomes? Do they have an action, verb, and an object? Are they appropriate to the program and its mission? Or are they just cookie cutter ones taken straight out of PAB? Which is fine, but you can make it mission specific. How are the outcomes measured? Are they appropriate and valid? Is there an assessment plan that says we're going to measure these courses this term, or this course this term, this course the following term? In the fall at a retreat, we're going to review the results of those 2 assessments, have a conversation as a faculty about what that means and talk about what changes might need to be made in other parts of our curriculum to get there. Or what changes need to be made to the rubric to capture what our students are learning better, because our measurement scheme had some flaws in it. That's fine. This is a work in progress. This isn't the end of the world here. And then finally, is there a feedback loop for improvement that's included in the student learning outcomes assessment? And that feedback loop could be everything from, do we need to rethink our curriculum? Do we need to revise the course content? I'm going from extreme to not extreme. So, or do we just need to celebrate, God, our students are really good? And they can demonstrate it by the work products that they produce, as evaluated either by our faculty, by the instructors of the courses, by outside practitioners who come in and sit down for an afternoon and review 5 of the students' theses or professional papers. And they review it for writing quality, blah, blah, you know, for a variety of the different learning outcome measures, perhaps using a rubric. And now you've got a, quote, more objective outside observer coming in and reviewing your students' work based on standards that you define that they can understand and absorb, okay? So, now I will state what my learning outcomes were for this session. Remember I said what the purpose was for the overall site visitor training, but let me tell you what my learning outcomes are for you. Site visitors will, action, verb, noun, will distinguish between program improvement goals and outcome measures. So each of you, if I were to measure you and assess how well both I did and you did, I would ask questions about, can you make that can you distinguish between a program improvement goal and a student learning outcome, and the fact that those are 2 separate outcome assessment processes. Can you distinguish between a learning outcome and measures for that outcome? In other words, what the statement of the outcome is versus how you would actually measure that outcome. Can you, action, verb, defend the need for defining and measuring outcomes? Can you defend why it is that we define and measure outcomes now in higher education? And then, can you apply a critical eye to the use of assessment results in improvement? Can you look at what a program has done, what it saw in its assessment results, and what it's deciding to do in the future about what it learned from those assessment results? And can you apply a critical eye to that? Can you say, yeah, looks like you're just doing it and writing it down, goes on the shelf, and the program director never shares it with anybody or sends it out in an email and nobody ever talks about it and life goes on? Or is it actually the focus of a conversation of the parties involved in achieving those learning outcomes? Okay? So site visitors will be able to do all of those things.